Bam, bam, let's go. All right. Okay, so thank you everyone for coming back from break. Yes, that is a pretty big QR code, and if you click on it, you'll just get everything that he said and then more. My name is Henri. I'm from the greatest city on the planet, which is Toronto, Canada. And not Toronto, Kansas. I found out the hard way that there is a Toronto in Kansas, and I don't know why. But I also work for an amazing company called Catchpoint, where we sort of like go into internet performance monitoring, amongst other things. And we have an amazing tool called Webpage Test. Anyone here familiar with Webpage Test? Cool, a few of you. Awesome. And we're going to not so much talk about the tool, but we're going to talk about web performance, certainly. So one of the things that I'd love to talk about, obviously, is web performance. And today what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of go through web performance and talk about sort of like web performance literacy and talk about what we look at when we basically look under the hood of all your web apps and websites online, and we talk about, you know, how we can improve the user experience. So with that being said, we're going to get things going right now. So as was mentioned, we're going to go through the alphabet, and I'm going to talk about pretty much terminology associated with web performance, starting with A. A, in our case, is going to stand for Aviv. So anyone here familiar with images? Yeah, okay, Aviv is one of the newer image formats. It's been out for a couple years now, but what we get out of that is compression. A smaller image format is always going to help your user experience. In all likelihood, and I say in all likelihood, but there are some exceptions, it's going to load simply faster. So keep that in mind. That's Aviv. Let me just move this. I'll be more comfortable. Now, we're going to talk about the letter B. B is going to stand for Brotli. Who here is familiar with Brotli? All right. Brotli is kind of like a cousin to gzipping. All right. So one thing you have to remember that there's nothing that happens on the internet without compression. And with Brotli, you're able to get better compression than gzipping. So a lot of your text assets, everything that comes down the wire essentially is being compressed. And Brotli is the preferred compression standard. So let's look at C. C in our case could stand for caching, but we are going to talk about Core Web Vitals. Familiar with Core Web Vitals? Hands up. All right. So this is a way, it's like a triplicate of metrics, and you're able to sort of gauge the health of a site or a web app. So it stands for, I mean, Core Web Vitals are something called LCP, which I'll talk about a little later, largest contentful paint. CLS, which stands for cumulative layout shift, something I won't talk about later. You could talk about, we could talk about outside in the hallway track, and something called FID, which is kind of like an interactive metric that is there for now, but long story short, it may be sunsetted for something a little better. Now, let's keep going. We're going to get into D. D is going to stand for defer. So with JavaScript execution, sometimes you want to have it execute immediately. All good. Sometimes you want to have it executing a little later, like you might use something like the async attribute. But in this case, we're going to talk about defer, where you're going to get that executed much later in later after the HTML is parsed, because sometimes you have some JavaScript that you do not need to have executed right away that might create like some long tags or something of the sort, but that's something you want to also look up. I'll be sharing the slides later on. That's why I have some of these links, because it's ready to go. E. E is going to stand for emissions. Now, this is something that is becoming more du jour, simply because we are starting to really pay attention to carbon emissions. And believe it or not, the internet has a significant footprint. Anywhere from 1% to 2% of carbon emissions right now on the planet are due to the internet and everything that we do. So we are starting to look at that very closely. You're going to see some mandates coming out of Europe in terms of reporting around carbon footprints. And And this is very closely associated with page weight. So if you don't manage the weight of your page properly, you're probably creating quite the emissions into the atmosphere. Let's talk about F. F is going to stand for fetch priority. So in this case, the internet is a wonderful thing. Browsers are a wonderful thing. And we're able to start to create situations where we want resources to load faster and earlier. And with fetch priority, we can do that. Now, has anyone played around with fetch priority yet? All good, a few of you? No problem. It's sort of like akin to like prefetching, preloading, pre-connecting, but what we're trying to do is to get the resource to execute or load as quickly as possible, because it might be something that we need to have done right away. Anyone know what the next letter is? Okay, that actually is mine. They put out a little campaign, and it is a soft G, folks. I'm sorry. So, GIF, yes, the letter G. And, you know, I was just trying to be playful, but the problem is that this image format is long in a tooth. Surprisingly, we still see a lot of it on the internet. It's a lossless format, which means it tends to be very heavy. People love animating the GIF because they want dancing cats on their page. Hey, that's all good. But the problem is, like I said, it is a heavy format. And we're finding out, again, as I mentioned, the heavier the page, the more emissions you're creating. All right. So there are ways of managing the GIF. Most of us like to have like maybe an actual video instead, but we understand the GIF provides this user experience that people love. But all I'm saying is manage it as best as possible. The greatest letter on the planet, which is H, obviously. This stands for HTTP, all right? The protocol that we love that basically gets all the resources down the pipe that we need. Now, most of you are probably using HTTP2, which allowed for something called multiplexing, where you're able to sort of get a lot more resources on one connection. You probably, if you look under the hood, you'll see that some resources are coming down using H3, all right? But unfortunately, you still see some resources on the net using the antiquated H.1, H1.1, where you're essentially not getting the speed and the connections that you can. So this is something that you definitely want to keep in mind. Sometimes you might have a slow site. You're like, okay, what's going on? I thought I did everything well. And when you pop the hood open and you see that there's a bunch of resources still coming down on H1.1, and it's actually a little surprising when we see that, because it's an old protocol that we really don't necessarily need because H2 is here. The letter I. Now, this is always kind of interesting because people love images, but in recent years, we've really found out that images are very challenging. And essentially, between like, you know, screen densities and, you know, like the formats that we have, ultimately, you might want to sort of like, how could I put it? Offload that to a service, maybe something like Imagix, something like Cloudinary. But the bottom line is images do create their own problem. Years ago, I gave a talk about images, and I was like, oh man, you know, images, new formats, and people didn't really know what I was talking about. But they've become, like I said, a bit of a burden, and that's because page weight. That's also because, you know, getting the right size down, because we're seeing, again, as performance practitioners, we pop the hood open and we're seeing poorly sized images, desktop assets going down to mobile. So these are things that we try to remind folks to manage as best as possible. Now, the letter J. So once upon a time, I gave this talk and I used to say like J stands for jank, because that was actually a term that we used to use. But in our case, I'm just going to talk about J standing for JPEG. And again, images being a bit of a challenge. The JPEG, the reason why I brought it up is it's actually a 30-year-old format, all right? Who here is under 30? Okay, like the JPEG was around, when you guys were born. So, and it's still around right now. Why? Well, it's a format that people love because it was a lossy format. It was the first one that we could actually sort of like populate a page with, and not really have some of that burden of page weight that we're experiencing with something like the PNG or something like the GIF, all right? The most popular format as well, simply because, again, it was lossy. But I'm saying right now, there are formats out there that can replace it, all right? So this is something that you want to keep in mind when you're sort of deploying. K is going to stand for kilobytes. Believe it or not, we do have a problem with the size of pages that are coming down the pipe. Man, like, at the 75th percentile, pages are like 4 megabytes. At the 90th percentile, they're almost, they're just a little past 8. All right. We're being liberal with the resources that we're sending down the pipe. So this is kind of a reminder that optimize as much as possible. Don't use resources that you don't need. And ultimately, things like lazy loading come in to play. These are very important. And I get back to the idea that you're going to see more regulations come down around missions. This is like a very early conversation, pardon me, but these are things that are literally happening as we speak. This is a good one right here. L is going to get back to something that I talked about earlier, which is the Core Web Vitals. And if you remember, I talked about LCP, which stands for Largest Contentful Paint. Now, why is this important? Well, A, it's one of the 3 Core Web Vitals, as I just mentioned. B, it's actually a metric that you also see. I'm sure some of you are familiar with Lighthouse. Yeah, no. Show of hands, maybe. So, okay, cool. So you may recall seeing largest contentful paint. Well, let me share to you that largest contentful paint is one of the metrics that developers struggle with the most. In fact, if I'm looking at my data right here, boom, only about 55% of pages have good largest contentful paint. What does that mean? Well, that means that it loads in 2.5 seconds or faster. That also means that 45% are doing it in 2.5 seconds or slower. And here's also a little nugget. Largest contentful paint challenges are mostly due to images, all right? So I get back to the idea that you get an image size properly, you're probably going to improve your largest contentful paint. I get back to the idea, if you use a more modern format that's going to come in smaller, you're probably also going to improve your largest contentful paint. Now, there are some other factors involved with that, but since it's kind of like a 70-30 split, by having properly sized images, properly compressed images, you're probably going to be able to improve that. And by the way, the other 30%, text. M stands for Metallica, one of my favorite bands, thank you. It also stands for measure. You cannot improve what you do not measure. I didn't mention it, but I'm a runner. Shout outs to the runners who came with me this morning. If you're in the room, big up, thank you. Ran a little 30-minute. It was like, was it 5K? I think we did 5K, yeah, it was. I'm trying to improve my 5K, all right? And I can't go in there blindly, no big deal, PB, 19 minutes, thank you. But the fact that I know that's 19 minutes, I'm gonna go in and be like, okay, can I break 19, all right? So you cannot improve what you cannot measure. So you absolutely have to measure performance of the app, because you cannot go in there blindly. I'm going to do an M prime. You also have to monitor. All right. Great companies out there will always monitor their performance. You know, Saturday night, you get that page saying something went wrong. That's monitoring right there. Deploying on a Friday, yo, I'll see you on Monday. Chaos. Saturday morning, if you don't monitor, you're going to find out the bad news on Monday. All right. Monitoring, very important part of the workflow in web performance. Oh, sorry about that. N. This is actually one of my favorites right here. N stands for the Network Information API. Anyone's heard of that API? Super, super cool. So what you could do, you could actually poll the network, all right? Browsers are amazing. It'll let you know whether it's like, it feels like 2G, feels like 3G, maybe it's 4G. And once you have that information, you can start to make decisions on what resources to run to send down the wire. Let me get back to images. Just say, you know, you have, I don't know, a newspaper and a sports page, and you want to talk about, you know, the Dolphins' next draft pick. You got a picture and, you know, high resolution image, whatever. But using this API, you find out you're out in the wild and it's like a 2G connection. Well, you can indicate then, oh, you know what? We're in a bad connection. I'm going to send down this black and white, or I might send out an SVG of the Dolphins logo instead, because it's going to come in smaller, and it's going to benefit from broadly compression, because SVG is just text math, right? These are things that are available to you so that you can make really good performance decisions. I got 10 minutes. Damn, I'm doing good. Well, at least I think I am. O is going to stand for offline. Kind of a bizarre case, but totally a case that you should keep in mind. A few years ago, I think it was like Jeep. They had this campaign, and it was about, like, you know, obviously be out in the wild, whatever. And their page worked offline, you know, because they assumed that you might be out in the woods, and we all know what connectivity is like in the woods, all right? So you can make a case for having offline capabilities, you know, subways, hello. I mean, some subways are getting Wi-Fi now, so whatever. Not in Toronto, though, you know. So these are things that I just want everyone to keep in mind, because we have the tooling available for us to do so. Now, P, yesterday I remember, was it Hassan? I think he talked about over at Next to do some prefetching, you know. They might even do some preloading. Now, this is, again, the browser's able to take some direction from you, and you're going to say, like, hey, I want this file to load immediately. And it might be an image, because you know that's going to be your largest content from Paint. So you're giving the browser the ability to bring in some of the crucial resources very early, so you can create that awesome user experience, have a good core web vitals. Now, I've seen, again, because we pop the hood and we look at sites, people get a little liberal. They're like, oh, I'm going to preload everything. Well, the browser knows, and they're going to say something like, hey, do not preload a resource unless you're going to have it used immediately. You'll get the warnings in the console for those of you, for the 3 of you who go in there and look. All right? So just be very judicious. Q, oh, I made a mistake here. Q does not stand for quit. Stands for quick. Essentially, another protocol, been around for a while. I don't want to get into the hairy details, but we're talking about right now 0 RTT, round trip times. Like we're trying to get these assets down the wire as quickly as possible. And these are the technologies that are available to us today. R, here's one of my favorites. R is going to stand for requests. The quickest request is the one never made. Take that in. You mean you're going to have lunch and it's going to hit you like, things are going to look different. So, but to be very honest, again, we pop the hood and we see sites with like 800 requests. Okay? If you don't need it, don't request it. All right? This is going to add to the performance conversation. And I could go through like a bunch of examples. It's kind of crazy. But ultimately, like I said, every piece of request is going to add to more or less your load time. All right. So if you don't necessarily need it, don't load that onto your page. S is going to stand for speed index. Again, if you're familiar with Lighthouse, you pop the hood and you see like you get this score. And speed index is really one of my favorite actually metrics, because you're able to really, by looking at this graph, you're like, okay, I know what's going on here. It basically gives you an idea of, how could I put it? Sort of like the completeness of the page load, all right? And again, this is something that you'll see when you pop the hood, and you may not have understood it real quickly, that well, pardon me, but at Webpage Test, we actually associate it with a graphic, which I'd love to, again, talk about if you have some time. T is going to stand for time to first byte, all right? It's not an official core or vital, though there's been a discussion that it could be, but this is a very important metric as well, because what does it mean? Well, how quick is that first byte coming down the wire, all right? Really quick example that I like to give is, again, because I run, 100-meter runner, they get into the blocks, and they work on their start for hours and hours and hours, because they realize a late start likely means they are not winning the race. Time to first byte is essentially the same thing. If your time to first byte is coming in late, your load is probably going to be nice late as well, which is not good. And again, ruining the user experience. U stands for User Timing API. I don't know if he's in the room, but who talked about it yesterday? Ken. Is Wheels in here? Okay, so, well, I know Wheels is not here. He's probably at the pool somewhere. Amazing API where, again, he talked about it yesterday. You could actually create marks in your app and measure a particular section that you think might be problematic. All right, so there's a bit of customization there. It's not discussed a lot because people actually don't like messing with it too much, because it's not super complicated, but it doesn't really provide the best developer experience, at least the ones that people like. V is going to stand for velocity. I'm sort of taking it back here. Velocity was a conference that used to happen as part of like O'Reilly's set of conferences. It was purely performance related. It was really awesome. A lot of the content is still out there if you want to look at it on YouTube. But it was kind of like the foundation for a lot of people. I used to go to this conference. It's sort of how I got my chops up as well. W, I'm sorry, but W is going to stand for Webpage Test. I'm sorry. No, but it really does. This is an amazing tool. I mean, I'm happy to sort of like give them outside, but this is what a lot of like big engineers use, my DMs. It's like, hey, what's going on here? I'm like, okay, boom, 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 I got you, We provide a lot of metrics, I'll be very honest. But the point is that by understanding what a lot of these metrics are about, things just look different. So, but W also stands for Waterfall. Who here likes to look at the Waterfall in DevTools or anything? I mean, it's cool because I know a lot of you don't, you know. Waterfalls can be intimidating, but once you understand what a waterfall is providing in terms of info, game changing. The way I describe it, it's kind of like, yeah, I like food. I like eating in restaurants. Then you became a chef. And it's like, oh, I know what's going on here. And understanding a waterfall is basically what happens, because so much can be determined just by looking at a waterfall, and especially ours. I'm sorry about that. X, easy peasy, user experience. Everything that we do right now, whether it be performance or anything else, it's all about the user experience. You know, do you have return users? I talk about, I go to Amazon sometimes because I'm bored, but I also know it loads fast, but I still go back. That's a good user experience. Y is going to stand for why slow. Old school performance tool out there. You know, it's still, you know, in the wild. So this is kind of like a history play. I just wanted to be cute. And Z stands for Zoffly. And again, getting back to some compression. And again, this is not super duper important, but I was like, Z. Let's use Zoffly. But to summarize, I really want to say this. This was about performance literacy. Because again, I really believe that if you understand performance, the terminology, the technology that's available to you, things will be different in your development career. And this is a coworker of mine, Scott Gell, big OG, put out a course last year, and we repackaged it and put it out there for free. And if you want the full QR code, it's here, and I'm going to tweet out the link as well. You could polish this off in a weekend, but again, it goes through some of this terminology that I went through, and this is really just for the web. Like, if you go through some of this stuff, your sites will load faster by default because you'll understand what needs to be dealt with when it comes to all the resources that are coming down the wire. And that being said, merci, gracias, and thank you.